Welcome, UAA members and fellow advisors across the state of Utah. My name's Tyler Morgan, and it is so good to welcome you to this live session. I would like to introduce today Elaine Lewis and Carrie Gary from UVU. They will be presenting Advising as Art and Science, Adopting an Analytics Platform.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon. I just did a presentation earlier today and everyone there was on the afternoon and I was still in the morning. But certainly glad to have you all here today. I'm going to go ahead and get our slides shared and get us all started. So make sure. All right. So we're so glad to have you all with us today. Carrie and I spent some time trying to think about what we would present on, and so often on our campus we're constantly fighting a battle of adoption related to our analytics platform. We know it's great, but sometimes it's a lot for advisors to manage in addition to taking care of their students, right? So we decided to put together some strategies for you that we would love to share with you today. You can see here we've identified some objectives for the session. We're going to focus most of our time on the second and the fourth objective here. The second one, simple and straightforward strategies. We know that those are the things that our advisors, at least in my office, are looking for. So let's find some ways to use those with our analytics platform. And then finally, strategies to incentivize usage and frame the value of our analytics platform is another one where we'll spend a good amount of time today. Our next thing here, I think, is something that we often think about. Why do we use data in advising? We get the question a lot, and often people specifically remind me that advising is an art and not a science, so data doesn't really fit. Carrie and I are here today to really debunk this myth and say that advising is both an art and a science, and we'll show you how you can use data to link to both of these things. Generally speaking, I think there's two great benefits of using data in advising. First, when we use a predictive analytics and data platform, we can teach our advisors to be more effective and intentional in targeting their outreach. So we are really providing the support that we need to the students who need it most, right? We can send an email to everybody, but why don't we send it to the students who really need it? Next, it saves us time and energy. So often within an analytics platform, we have the opportunity to kind of narrow down our outreach so we can focus on the students who need it, saving that time, but also it appears really intentional. And that's something that we're striving to do, to really identify our impact in our work and make sure that we are using our time in the most efficient ways possible to save us time to invest in the students that need us most.
Okay, so just to kind of give a quick rundown of what we're specifically using at UVU for predictive analytics. We are using a vendor, primarily Civitas Learning. The focus of the predictive analytics right now is they're predicting the student's likelihood to persist, which we define as a pattern of enrollment from fall to spring, or spring to fall. And so when we purchased this system, we purchased two things, right? So we purchased the data model, which is their data scientists are taking our data, they're consuming it, and they're calculating students' persistence prediction. But we also got a technology solution from them. They give us applications, a user interface that has all these functions and features, workflow features that allow advisors to surface within their caseload the students' persistence prediction, to narrow down the students to specific cohorts, and then to provide some type of outreach, typically through email. I want to emphasize that in this presentation, we will be talking about predictive analytics primarily, but if you're in a situation where maybe you haven't adopted such a system, like you don't have access to predictive analytics, I'm willing to bet that you still have access, probably from your institutional research, you have access to other data insights, you know other risk factors for your students that can contribute to like their non-success. So I would say that even if you don't have predictive analytics, you still have access to data that lets you know what is and is not a risk factor for your students, and you can use that data to narrow down to those students who have risk in order to give them that meaningful support. Next slide. So let's get down into the strategies. I'm not jumping it. Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, so just predictive analytics, just kind of a quick dirty what's in the sauce. What you do with predictive analytics is you have this desired outcome from your students: graduation, persistence, retention, course completion, any type of flavor you have. You compare students who completed, who met that outcome in your historical data versus students who did not, and you tease out these patterns of what is significant between these populations, and you use that to build a model to calculate their probability. You use that to calculate the probability of current students to meet that outcome. And the reason we really care about this is that we have found, sorry, I'm jumping ahead in my notes here. There we go. The reason we care about this is to kind of emphasize, Elaine, what she said at the start, is that we use this to focus outreach. You know, the students who are less likely to meet that desired outcome, when we identify those students, we can provide meaningful outreach. And we also find in our research, when we use these predictors, we find that advising is really impactful to improve persistence for our students, particularly those less likely to persist. And this is really refreshing because it tells us that these students who are less likely to achieve these outcomes, they're at risk of dropping out. These aren't lost causes. If we can identify who they are, and if we can have our advising to make time to meaningfully support them, then we can help a lot of these students stay on track. So for advice, next slide. Yeah, thanks. So predictors. There are two ways primarily we're asking our advisors to use these predictors. Firstly, we ask them to identify within their caseload at the start of the term those less likely to persist. We ask them to kind of keep an eye on those students and to develop strategies to meaningfully support them, you know, to apply their expertise as advising to these students because they are impactful to these students' experience to stay on track. The second type of predictor we're looking for is we ask them to focus on students who started the term in one way, but they had a decrease in their probability, right? They were this likely to persist, but then they had a downward shift for some reason. And those downward shifts are largely driven by student behavior during the term. So what we do for advising is we ask them to keep track of those who start the term, those who have a downward shift. And in particular, for those who have a downward shift, we ask them to make contact with them, to do an outreach with those students within a week of the downward shift. Thus, you get that timeliness.
Okay, so Carrie got to provide you all with the science behind the predictors, what ones we use, why we use them. Now I have an opportunity to show you a very text-heavy slide, so prepare yourselves, but to give some examples of the art of how we might actually put these predictors into practice. We'll quickly walk through these three examples based on information that Carrie just provided us to kind of get a feel of what that art might look like. First, often downward shifts in prediction are the result of changes in an LMS grade. We can see a general outreach that appears personal without knowing a specific course, right? This first example humanizes the potential of being overwhelmed for a student and makes it something natural that everyone, including the advisor, actually experiences and offers a tip about how to overcome it. Our next example is informed by a historical prediction shift that we know instead of just one specific to a student. We are very familiar that a decline in persistence often happens around midterm grades. A student takes a test and doesn't do so well, and the predictors go down. So let's send something to the students preemptively ahead of that downward shift. In this example, you can see that the student may have some test anxiety, so it's natural, and it offers a clear action to review these 10 tips that will help with it, and also recognizes someone on our campus who's an expert in this area. And it says that person's a friend, it's someone that the student can trust because their advisor trusts them. Last, this one counts on the persistent shifts that occur around registration. We specifically see a decline if a student has not yet registered for classes for the next semester. A message that appears personal, I see you haven't registered yet, and a prompt to talk about it helps the student to prioritize the action and know that someone is looking out for them and cares.
All right, so the second strategy we're using around analytics is what we call nudging. For those who aren't familiar, nudging is a behavioral economics area where they study how the context in which people make decisions or how information is withheld or presented to people, how it affects decision making. Basically, it's the study of decision making. Sorry, I got a little distracted by that note. It's basically the study of how decisions can be subtly and unconsciously influenced. And to kind of emphasize what we're talking about here, I want you to imagine a scenario where you have research before you that says students in your institution succeed at better rates if they complete that general education math class within their first year or very earlier in their career. Now I want you to imagine a student at your institution who's sitting down into the registration system to make a decision about what courses he'll register next term. And though he might have like a degree plan in front of him that tells him, okay, in this next semester, your second semester here, we want you to take your general ed math. Perhaps the student doesn't know that it's important for him to take it early. Perhaps that has not been communicated to him in a way that he can understand or even at all. And it certainly probably isn't being emphasized in your registration system. So all things being equal to the student, he might think, you know, I don't particularly enjoy math. I think I'll just keep kicking this can down the road and take it later. And the reason I bring up this scenario is I think I would approach nudging and the strategies I'm going to show you in the next slide with this concept of, am I confident that the student has the information they need to make a good decision? And how can I make it easier for the student to get that information to make a good decision? And just to add before we go to the next slide, I would say if analytics, like these powerful predictors, you know, in that example, that math example I just brought up, if analytics are interventions for you to, are signals for you to intervene, then I would say that nudging is a communication strategy to deliver that intervention. Next slide, please. So 3 specific strategies for nudging. And by the way, these are not comprehensive to all of nudging. They're just some really, I think, great simple ways to get you started. So the first thing we find that it's a good strategy for nudging is consider them to be targeted. We call it 2 attributes here, the timeliness and the personally relevant. When we refer to timeliness, we say consider that point in the term when the student needs to make that decision, and then time your messages around that point of decision, right? So you wouldn't release a registration nudge, you know, August 1st if you want to influence spring registration. You get closer to that point of decision when registration opens. We talk about personally relevant. Nudges they're not spam. It's not general announcements you send out. It's not this digest of here are the 5 things you need to know coming up. It's very targeted. You take time as the sender to make sure the student's receiving the message. It's going to be very specific to their situation. So going back to my example, it's students who haven't completed general education math by a certain point in their career. We call action driven. Again, so these messages have a singular purpose, right? You're trying to influence the students to make better decisions by making sure they've got that information. So your purpose as a sender is singular. You're very clear why you're sending it. Let's talk about getting you into a GE math class, for example. So you're very clear in your purpose. And we say it has a very specific action that's easy to accomplish. You want the student to engage in a specific action, you know, enroll in a math class. And when I say easy to accomplish, I would say it's on you to make sure that the number of steps it takes for a student to complete that action, you can keep them as low as possible, you know, like make sure you put a link to your registration system or you link to all the available GE math classes. You make sure if they need to fill out a form that they have a link or they have a PDF attachment of that form. You just want to take out the number of steps it takes for them to accomplish the best action. That way it's easier for them to do it. And then we call out something as being positive. I would say your language should focus on the benefit of completing the action rather than talk about the consequences of not completing the action, right? One thing that's kind of fascinating is that sometimes what we choose to emphasize in our language, whether we talk about positive benefit or consequences of not doing it, that will sometimes normalize in the student's mind what they should or shouldn't do, right? So if you talk about the consequences of not doing it, they might begin to think, well, maybe it's not a big deal, I don't do it. But more than that, I think people just respond better to positive messages versus maybe messages that might induce some type of anxiety in them.
So now we get to look at the science, the examples of the science in the art, right? And we'll kind of go in an opposite order that Carrie did. Our first example here really highlights the positivity. Instead of talking about a less than stellar grade, or if you don't go to tutoring, you're gonna fail a class, we flipped it around and we focused on the positive. 80% of students who visit a tutor for the course improve 1 letter grade on their next test. So there's an incentive for the student and a positive consequence, or a positive result rather, from visiting that tutor, and that's what we're sharing with the student. Our next one here has that very strong call to action. When we ask the student to respond with a basic rating 1 to 5, it's simple and it's quick. And in our experience in my advising center, our advisors that use this actual nudge and outreach to a student, they receive more responses to this question than any other email they send all semester. That response of the simple 1 to 5 rating makes a huge difference for students, and they really kind of latch on to that at the beginning of the term. Last, targeting, as Carrie talked about first in this section, is always a great thing to do. Your predictive analytics tool can make this really simple through reports and available filters. You can filter for all the students that are a certain major who have not enrolled in a specific course, and then nudge them to do so. This message appears very personal because you're sending it to a batch of students at once to cut down time, and it makes it much more personal too. So one note we'll share here, you can tell we care a lot about math at our institution. Carrie used it in her example, and I used it in mine too. But there's a really important piece of this. It's not just, hey, take math. It says this will help you stay on track to start your business classes, right? There's a reason why behind it. It's not simply take this course. We're going to tell you why it's going to matter. And if we tell the student why it matters, there's a higher likelihood that they're actually going to take us up on our offer.
Yeah, I mean, it's always math, right, that students are putting off. Yeah. So let's talk about narrowing outreaches. So going back, I mentioned nudging, that nudging isn't general announcements, right? It's not spam. And I would say that narrowing outreach kind of builds off this idea of you want to narrow your population. When you perform outreaches to students, you're trying to communicate information and deliver your expertise as an advisor, you want to narrow your populations down to specific attributes known to be important to success. And the reason being is that goes back to the idea of that personal relevance, right? If a student reads an email and it doesn't apply to them, you know, they're going to toss it, and you don't want them to associate your name with somebody who just delivers spam to them, right? They think, here's from my advisor. They're going to tell me something I need to know today, right? So that's why we recommend that you use things like filters or some way to narrow your outreach down to your subpopulation of your caseload based on attributes you know are significant to student success. To the next slide. To that end, the reason we really encourage this is that it helps that personalization, as I've been alluding to. And so some strategies we do is that where possible, address the email by name instead of going, dear student, you like, hello, Jane. You may not, that can be tricky to do. It's dependent largely on your the system you're using being able to feed over the student's name in some way, some variable. I mean, it can be done, but that can be tricky to do. And where possible, call out something unique in that population, right? So if you're targeting, say, your human anatomy students, because your human anatomy students always struggle, and so you want to start the term off right with them, just call out, hey, Jane, I see you're in human anatomy. Let's talk about some strategies that are going to help you with that, that kind of thing. We call it adjusting. Be comfortable with the idea that you're going to maybe run multiple versions of the same intervention based on these different attributes, right? So going back to my example, human anatomy, hey, Jane, then you might be like, hey, John, I see you're in math 1050, because that's another one I think students need some extra help for. So it's the same idea of where you target students who are in these courses you know are problematic for success. In this example I'm showing, and then you vary based on the course, and then you do call out that course, because again, it reinforces in the student, okay, this is personally relevant to me. I am in this course this term. And the last one, that validate honor experiences of students. I'm going to tap in Elaine to kind of elaborate on this, because I see this as sort of a relational component, this idea of maybe throughout the term addressing those normal things like, I know you might be feeling anxious, or I know it's overwhelmed, it's midterms. Is that how you see that last point, Elaine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to recognize that each student does have a personal experience, and oftentimes that's where the pushback of the art component comes in, and validating their experiences is going to be really critical to make sure that students are going to feel comfortable with us, and also that they're human, and that humanizing component is really incredible. So, and with that, we'll show a couple examples here on this slide as well of what that might look like. So using predictors and nudges are kind of a component of how we can narrow our outreach, as Carrie mentioned earlier, and these are some great ways to kind of wrap up the conversation. You'll notice that all 3 emails here are personalized with the greeting, and Carrie mentioned that not all systems do this, but most will. So if you can add these variable fields, it makes things easier for you, but it also personalizes it for the student without having to send one individual item every single time. All 3 of these messages have that personalization, and that filtering makes it easier. Not every student's predictive score is the same, so we shouldn't send everyone the same message, and you can see that here in the second one. This is a message that's more targeted, as you can note with that at-risk indicator, for students who are a little less likely to persist, right? So students who visit with their advisor typically have a higher GPA. Did you know that, right? And maybe we're sending it to those students that really need to come in and visit with us based on a prediction score. It's important for us to connect, and I'd love to hear something personal about you, like the specific course that you're enrolled in. Last, as Carrie and I just talked about, our outreach should validate our students' experience. So often students feel that they are the only one experiencing a struggle. And we know that we need to validate that struggle and let them know it's a real thing, right? It's a real struggle that they experience. So it's especially needed, I think, with our first generation students who may not have anyone else in their life that's there to validate their experience of test anxiety or a rough grade on an exam. But it's also really important for our high achieving students. Some of them, this will be the first opportunity when they come to college to experience a grade lower than an A. And handling that and validating the experience of it's okay to get a B is very important for students as well. So although we may not know their specific grade in a course, we can certainly have a conversation based on the data that's available to us that will really be intentional and help target the student and their experience.
Okay. So are we going to take this opportunity to try to do some feedback from the audience? Okay. So you see, we just summed up 3 different strategies in advising that we use for using data analytics. You know, that predictors, identifying students less likely to persist in order to make contact with them specifically, nudging, a strategy of communicating students to help them make better decisions, and narrowing outreach in order to have that personalized touch in their communications. So the question we have for the team is, of these 3 strategies presented, which do you plan to use going forward as an advisor? Have we gotten any feedback from the audience? Okay.
It looks like there's 2 or 3 items in there.
Oh, I see. I think I was on the wrong tab. Can you read them out, Alina? I'm not seeing them.
One response is all 3. We are just getting started with predictive analytics at WSU, so Weber, I assume. Nudging, Tasha says nudging and narrowing outreach. Another person also agrees all of them.
Okay, yeah.
Variety of different things there.
Yeah. Oh, great. So yeah, my live Q&A wasn't populating. It just opened. So I really do appreciate the feedback. And as a bonus, we wanted to let you know this question is actually another example of nudging. And the reason being is that because it did not actually list a 4th option, which is none, right? You could come back and say, I'm not going to do anything differently, and then you can leave the room, I guess. But this is an example of nudging, and that by listing these 3 options and phrasing in such a way to imply that you should consider these, it makes you more likely to seriously consider and go back and internally reflect and consider these options. So that's another example of nudging we thought you might be interested in using.
Great. And we do have a question that I tried to type a response to, but as you can see, the slides moved forward on me and unknown to me when I did that. So Daniel asked a great question about how we work with individuals who may be critical of predictive analytics. And that's kind of what our next section is going to be about. So please hold us accountable. If you feel like we didn't answer the question, you let us know and we'll circle back to it as needed.
All right. By the way, that hamster, that was like the only picture I picked for this presentation. So I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, so let's talk about deployment of a predictive analytics system. And by deployment, I don't mean the period of time where your data and your IR and your your data and technology people are working with the vendor to build something, right? I'm talking day 1, they put the key in the ignition and you, the user, are ready to use the system, right? So we turn on this system, we sort of hype it up usually, and we've got this training session. We do implementation training. It's like 2 to 4 hours typically, and it's usually jammed packed full of information. Like they're like, here's the data, here's why it's going to change your life as an advisor. And they also give you that technology rundown, like here's all the different features and functions, and they take you through these click paths, you know, and then they send you on your way. And they're like, okay, hope you use it. We really want you to. And then months later, we check in, we find that nobody's really using these systems, or maybe they're doing a little bit, they're not getting what we had hoped out of them. And I would argue that, and this is not just predictive analytics cycle, I see this happen for a lot of different initiatives, but I would argue the primary reason we're not getting adoption from these systems as we hoped is that it's not a data and technology problem. That's not to excuse where data and technology is falling short. What we're really getting at here is that using analytics is a different way of being an advisor than I think a lot of people have been used to. So what we're really driving at with this adoption of the systems is a behavioral change. And data and technology really can't facilitate that. I argue it's got to really come from in the organization just making engaging in purposeful strategies to encourage usage and to really push for usage of these systems. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, no more hamster. So I would say straight off is that you have to make sure the people who are adopting the system, the advisors, they can answer that first question. You have to communicate a belief from the outset. You know, people have to know why we're using the system and how it's important to our student success goals. When you communicate this belief, you don't preach at people. It's really a discussion. I mean, it's not a discussion of whether or not we're going to use analytics because you already bought the tool and you turned on the system, right? So that's not the discussion. It's a discussion of what do you need to know? What questions do you need answered to make sure you are comfortable and you know what needs to be done with this system. Additionally, we call out that it's important to set goals and actions, you know, be very specific. This is how often we recommend you get in the system. Here's how we recommend you use it, right? We like calling back those predictors. We ask people to make contact for students less likely to persist or those who had a decrease, right? Those are some specific actions we've recommended, right? And as for goals, you know, again, calling out specifically how you want people to use the system. But there's also this human factor, and that's where you need to, again, manage expectations, but I think acknowledge, uncertainty and maybe skepticism and anxiety. If this is a different way of doing work, you need to make sure that you call out people and you acknowledge that could be happening. You help manage those feelings, but you don't let them be an excuse to just ignore analytics.
So we've talked about that theoretical. This is how you get people to come together and love your analytics platform. But in reality, right, we know people are going to be critical and skeptical and have questions. So we've identified 3 different items we're going to walk through: building a community, setting goals, and recognizing and rewarding, that are going to help frame some more practical things that you can do from a leadership side or even from a grassroots component to help make this a successful experience. So the first one here you can see is to guarantee training to empower and retrain. Our analytic systems are constantly making updates, and we're also learning better and more efficient ways to do things. Carrie shared this when she talked about really that training component, but in order to build a community, we need more than just a simple turn on the system training, right? We need to embed training opportunities with advanced skills all year long, every single year, not just the first year that you launch a tool. So for example, Carrie and her colleagues are always producing new reports that we include as part of our staff meeting in my area, to create that curriculum for our staff meeting where we can build a great way to create confidence around our tool, right? So often individuals are skeptical, at least in my area, that the information is even accurate, and we should be trusting it. So using these resources that Carrie provides us allow us to empower our advisors to try new things and feel confident in what they're doing, right? You can't screw it up. It's going to be okay. Walking people through that is really important. Also, as a leader or someone kind of working with the tool who's embraced it, we need to do our best to communicate our belief that the analytics platform actually works, right? We need to show and explain the why behind things. Just like I mentioned, well, why do you need to take the math course? It's the same kind of concept for advisors. Why do we need to use predictive analytics? And we've talked to you a little bit about that already. But some of the small things that we've implemented in our area, we send a weekly update every week, and twice a month I try to embed something that's called an Inspire Insight. That's the tool that we use. And Carrie also shares a lot of great information with the supervisors to help understand the system. And then I chunk it down into a couple quick sentences of, hey, did you know this? To get our brains moving on a topic and help us understand why maybe we should be doing this. An example is we know about 42 or 43 days before the semester starts is really that tipping point for student success for registration. So we really use that as part of our tool. We set reminders on our calendar that a couple days before that, we're going to start some more outreach to really push registration. Our last one here is to encourage collaboration. It makes learning a new system or trying something different a bit less daunting for people. We launched 2 great collaborative spaces for our team this past year related to both pandemic response and adopting our analytics platform. So our first one is our use of a Teams channel. If you're not comfortable with Teams and other platforms like Slack, it's basically a messaging platform to post updates on the system and encourage our team to share ideas about how they might be using the tool. We also have instituted an optional, what we call outreach tea time each week, where advisors are encouraged to get together and brainstorm what outreach that they have on their plan for that week and what it looks like and what they're going to say and who's going to say what, and get some great ideas to really kind of get the juices flowing and get some good ideas shared out there with their team. Carrie, do you have any thoughts to add to that one?
Yeah, just to reinforce for training, when you do training, make sure that you feel that your people are confident that they understand the data and the technology, right? If you're getting both solutions from a vendor, they are understanding what is the purpose of the data and here are the features and functions and the click path to do what I need to do in the system. Yeah.
So our next tip we've talked a lot about a little bit already in that setting goals. So the first one is we don't need to set 7 goals, 10 goals, right? Let's focus on a couple that are much more manageable. This year in my area, we really focused on one particular goal, and that was identifying a downward persistence shift, right? So we expected messages to go out within 7 days to a student who experienced a persistence shift. And we had some trainings about what you might say in those. Oftentimes, our advisors struggled with, well, I don't know why the persistence changed, so what am I supposed to say? So we helped build some empowering language and communication and conversation around that, so that even though it was, maybe they didn't know exactly why the shift happened, they would have a little bit of background and some good ideas there. The next one is to honor time commitments and check progress, right? We know time of our advisors is valuable, and there are certain weeks that we may not even be able to touch our analytics platform. At UVU, for my advisors, that was last week. So we recognize that, and we try to build our outreach planning around it. We also encourage our advisors to block specific time to focus on their analytics platform on their calendar. Sometimes our advisors are not crazy about this because they want to spend the time with the students. But as we mentioned when we spoke about why data, setting aside time is something that's important in the use of the platform now. So it's going to save us time in the long run if we're really intentional about that small chunk of time we're investing fully in the product right now. The last one here is to encourage ownership and expertise. And I think that's where we try to get some of those folks on board that may not initially be in favor of the platform. I don't carry an advising caseload in my area, so there are a lot of things that I'm limited in providing example and setting example for. So instead, I rely on some of my advisors on our team to become the experts in our group, to share the ownership of a certain topic. So as an example, I have one advisor I can always count on to notice if there's an error in the system, if something's not working correctly, the login isn't working, whatever that may be. There's a couple others that are rock stars at building communications with inclusive language to make sure that we're being accessible in what we're doing and we're not isolating students through our communication. And I have another one who has the most outstanding open rates on their messages. I don't know how or why, so we try to use her as our expert to share with others and help us learn about what's going on here. Any thoughts from the data expert, Carrie?
I love that line, encourage ownership and expertise. I think so when you begin these systems, I think sometimes people are going to be, they're not going to be as mature and maybe their data and technology maturity. But again, as long as you keep working with them, they're going to have more autonomy. They're going to bring more ideas and more insight to the job once they really get going with it. So yeah, I love that line.
Our last one here is, I think, what we all know, but sometimes we have a challenge with. We need to reward good work and recognize those individuals to build buy-in in the system, right? And oftentimes we can't just give someone extra money for learning a tool, right? So we have to find other more creative ways to do it. One of the things that we do with kind of individuals who are more concerned about the validity of the system or whether it's the right thing to do or not, we're always trying to close the loop on concerns. So discussing a concern and elevating it. For my team, it's sending a message in our Teams channel when they have a question or an idea about how to improve our system. And then I send it to Carrie, and Carrie gives me some info, and sometimes it takes a few days and sometimes it doesn't, but I'm constantly updating my team and closing the loop with them about what happened with their concern. So it really helps to validate what they're feeling about the tool and any questions that they may have. They've got a doubt in the system. Let's dive in and try to figure out what's causing that doubt and where we can go from there. A next one we've kind of talked about a little bit already on the last slide, and that's identifying experts to call out for success in learning. Sometimes we know that we need to reward our advisors too. So whenever I ask one of my advisors to be an expert in residence, we try to think of some sort of small reward, and it could be something simple like, hey, did you know so-and-so had, this many responses to an outreach? Here's what they sent. Congratulations to this advisor, right? or if it's something a little bit larger, like some incentives if they give a presentation to the rest of our team, things like that. A last one here I think is really important and kind of scary from the management side, but we need to set clear goals, but we also need to publicize our benchmarks and incentivize our accomplishments. So we've built our analytics platform and the idea of predictive analytics and new technology into not just our job descriptions in our area, but also our annual evaluations. We check with our team once a month on their progress in the system. I get to download a report to see who's sending what and send it out to the direct supervisors in my area. And we really try to use that as a benchmark for improvement for another term, not necessarily as you need to do better, but let's strive to do more, right? And that's an important approach for us.
Yeah. Am I cutting you off?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I just to emphasize that first point, I do love it when people come and say, I think there's something wrong with the system first. So as a technology manager, I'm like, yes, I need more eyes on the system. I hate when there's something wrong and it gets missed for weeks or even months, you know? So again, I love that. But I also like as an opportunity to engage with people and just reinforce, you know, if they have complaints about the system, to acknowledge, you're right, this is kind of clunky, or you're right, they could have done this better. And I think it helps people to see, yeah, I think it's important not to shut down those conversations, but to validate them, but also to kind of keep it back focused on, you're right, this isn't the best use, but let's focus on maybe the bigger picture here, or let's find maybe if we can see a workaround that works better for you. I think it's important at the very least to make sure people feel heard and acknowledged.
Awesome. So I'm going to circle back a little bit to the question that we got earlier, and I now am, oh, maybe not, for some reason, can't really access part of this. So I see that there's a question still here in the chat about people who are concerned about the safety of the data, right? Profiling students or questions about validity, and I think we've addressed validity well, but the concerns about profiling students is definitely something that we need to consider, and making sure that it's clear to your team that your analytics platform and what you're using has been vetted through for FERPA compliance, through your general counsel at your institution is really important. Because they need to feel that level of confidence, right? Digging into the student's life in this way is completely legal, if you will. It may be different than something that we've ever done before, but it's certainly something that's not negative in that way. So that's one kind of piece about that profiling part that I think is really important to consider and latch on to. Carrie, do you have any other thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I absolutely get that concern. It can feel sort of invasive to really dig into that student's profile in such a way. But I think in my mind, I don't see it profiling perhaps in the negative sense. I see it as who needs my help more. You know, I think sometimes when we sit back and we wait for students to cry out to us, a lot of them are going to get missed because they don't know who to cry out to. That's kind of a dramatic term, but they don't know where to ask for help or who to ask for help, or sometimes they discourage themselves. So I see this as like, who gets more of my time as an advisor? Who do I make special time for to just ask and check in with and see if I can provide my expertise with, right? So we don't use these predictive analytics for deterministic purposes, right? We don't write off these students. Oh, you're less likely to persist, you know, get out of my office. We use to say, no, I want to spend more time with you, right? In order to help you stay on track. So that's how I see its use.
Awesome. It looks like we have one more question in the chat as well from Tasha. And Carrie, I think that you might be a good expert on that one. So when a persistent shift isn't necessarily showing up because when a student's maybe dropped a course or something else has happened, can you walk through that?
So I have a hard time with inspired capture. I'm reading out the question. Maybe I'm not quite following this. Are you saying that they, and I don't think they can talk back, sorry, they can only maybe chat, and there's a delay. My inference from this question is that they are low persistence, but they're not changing. So if I'm understanding that correctly, I do know that Inspire has a way to just narrow down to specific prediction scores, right? So you could just go for the students who are very low, low, and moderate, and they may not be having a downward shift because, right, their behavior hasn't changed. They're predicting as expected, which still may not be great, right? So I would say use those prediction categories. They give you a chance to filter down to very low, low, and moderate, and you can use that to filter to students who start low and are remaining low as a way to target those students. If I answered that correctly, that was my take.
Awesome. So I'm going to quickly go to our last slide and then we'll open it up for more questions. There might be another one in the chat. Just as a plug, so you all are already academic advisors and we know that you're awesome. But I bet you also know some people who aren't academic advisors or don't even work in higher education even, that could also be really awesome advisors. We're all in a helping profession. We love students, and we are currently in my office recruiting some new folks, more than one, several different new counselors in our area. And we would love if you know someone that might be interested, if you could share the word for us about that position. It's a great one, and we're excited about our work with students and using predictive analytics tools as well. But certainly something that we'd love for you to share with anyone that you know that might be interested. And with that, Carrie and I have our contact information here. We'll post it in the published questions section as well. And with that, I'm going to stop the screen share and check for the rest of our questions.
Okay, so Tasha published a follow-up. She said, I have seen students who are failing, I assume at failing at their courses, but they aren't showing as low persistence. In this case, so these data models, they are consuming a lot of different data points. So it's entirely possible that failing data, though logically it says to us it should cause a downward shift, it's mathematically probably not, that's what's not causing the student to downward shift. But nevertheless, you have another insight about the student outside of that individual predictor score that's saying this student is struggling, like you're knowing that they're not doing well in their classes. So I would say that's the intervention point for you. That's something to jump on and start working with that student.
Awesome. That looks like it. And it looks like we're right on time. So we will check you all later. Thanks. Oh, and Tyler's going to say something, it looks like.
I am. I just want to thank you, Elaine and Carrie, so much. You have given us so much good information, so much to think about. And I know there's been a little chatter with my school saying that there's things that we want to implement and do. So we appreciate all your preparation and hard work in putting this together. What a great session today. So thank you, UVU, for your good work.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. And we'll see you all next